I'm Edward Ashley for the Screen Actors Guild Legacy Series. This program was conceived and developed by actors, primarily for actors, as a living legacy for our membership, present and future, and to honor those famous names that are forever part of motion picture history. Whoever an actor is, whatever an actor does, is reflected in his work. His work is the mirror of his art, revealed in the humanity he portrays. A high and ancient calling, and the demands are great. Talent must be carefully nurtured and developed, the mind trained to observe unceasingly and transmute its impressions into characters. Only the greatest have fully met these demands, and certainly one of our greatest is Henry Fonda, in an actor-to-actor interview with Charlton Heston on December 15th, 1979. Mr. Heston, a former president of the Screen Actors Guild and currently chairman of the board of the American Film Institute.
An English critic in the 19th century said something about acting that I have remembered. He said, in the beginning, an actor impresses an audience with his looks, then with his voice. And as he grows, it's his performance that they remember. But in the end, what touches us all most deeply and permanently is what he is. Of all the major American actors of our time, I think that is as true of Henry Fonda as it is of anybody. When I was a kid just out of the Michigan woods, some of the early movies I remembered were his. When I first went to Broadway, while he was in the middle of his triumphant run in Mr. Roberts. People imagine that actors are very self-confident and outgoing, and I think often they're just the reverse.
Yeah.
I think some performers,
It's
like
true.
singers and comedians, may be
That's true.
extroverted,
Yeah.
but I think also
Many feel, as I and you're talking about, that to play the part is therapy for self-confidence.
well, there's somebody to hide in, somebody
You're in
else
back
to
of
be.
a mask.
Talk a little bit about. You started to say about the Cape Cod and the university players, because there must have been some useful experience
They were
there.
that was the great, probably the top 4 years of 4 summers really of my life, and I think Josh Logan and Jim Stewart who was in part of it, Mildred Natwick and
Remarkable
Ken Smith,
group for what
Margaret
was,
Sullivan. Yeah, I think they would all agree that it was a high point for them. We were all young. Most of them were undergraduates still. I got into it really by almost a fluke. I wound up, without really going into too much detail, and I got a job at the Cape Playhouse at Dennis, which is one of the first summer theaters. Now, this is 1928. It had formed in 1927, so it was only the second year of summer theater, and there was one in Provincetown and the one at Dennis, Cape Cod Playhouse. I think there was one on Long Island. There weren't too many. It was the beginning of summer theater, really. And I hadn't heard of it, but by the time I got to Cape Cod, I had. And I went to Provincetown, and then I stopped off in Dennis on the way down on the train. Anyway, again, without going into the details, they said, well, if you can stick around and work backstage as a third assistant director, we can't pay salaries, but if you can afford it, that something might happen. That's all I needed. I'd saved $100, and I had $100 one of these. And I stayed, and I worked for 3 or 4 weeks at the Playhouse there as a third assistant director, as third assistant stage manager. And the third week, I think it was, the juvenile who was coming down to play the young man in The Barker wired that he couldn't make it at the last minute. And without, again, going into detail, I was given a reading for the part because I looked at it. I was apple-cheeked and the straw sticking out of my clothes practically. And I got the part. And Bernie Hannigan, a mutual friend of mine from Omaha, who was a Harvard boy, he was going to summer school, and he knew the gang that had started this University Players further south in the Cape, came to see me in the Barker, and the next week came down from summer school and said, because I wasn't working that week, let's go down and see the play they're doing at Falmouth. So he drove me down, and we couldn't get seats together. I remember that. We had to get single seats. So I found myself sitting between two Cape Cod dowagers, and the play was The Torchbearers. No, I didn't know what the play was before I saw it.
Isn't that play about a community
little
theater?
theaters? Yeah,
it's about
a
little
George
theater.
Kelly
Yeah.
riotous comedy. Well, Josh Logan, none of these people meant anything. They were all undergraduates from Harvard or Princeton, and girls from Smith, Vassar, and Radcliffe. And Josh Logan was playing Huxley Hossafras with the craziest readings and way of talking that I've ever heard. And John Swope was playing, I think his name was Twiller, whose mustache kept falling off in the play. In other words, this was little theater and all the things that can happen.
Going wrong, sure.
I was hysterical. I would fall on this dowager and this one. And Josh tells the story because he had never heard such laughs coming from an audience. And when I went back with Bernie afterwards, and he said, was that? And then he broke into laugh. And he tells a story that it was love at first sight, and he's loved me ever since because I've laughed at him. And they invited me to stay, and I went back to Dennis and moved my trunk down to Falmouth, and I joined them. Their third week of their first year. And I came back every summer, because they all went back to school, undergraduates. I went to New York and starved in New York and got understudy jobs. But I was with them for the next 4 years. We eventually built a theater at Old Silver Beach in West Falmouth. And as I said, I named some of the actors. We played 10 plays every summer. I was able then to play, well, over the years, I probably played 200 of the best parts written for a young actor. Where do you get that chance today, you know?
Yeah.
So it was the great, great training ground. It was not going to school. It was really acting before audiences with Bertain Windus directing. He was one of the best. He wound up directing the Lunts for the Theater Guild.
Absolutely.
Josh Logan. Anyway, that's why those were some of the great years of my life. And working with Margaret Sullivan, Jim Stewart, Josh and Wendy.
Well, I don't know, though. Of course, you've done mostly American parts, but I remember one of your performances I liked the best was Pierre in War and Peace.
It did turn out well,
yes,
yeah.
I
wouldn't have cast myself, but I wasn't going to tell them that when they offered it to me.
That's one of those parts you don't let go if it comes by. But did you feel, in the early days at least, that being a Midwesterner gave you a certain kind of, head start at a certain kind of role?
I didn't think of that. I thought about how it limited me, though, a lot, because in many companies, and I played as an example in a theater in Washington, D.C., 2 winter seasons, the National Junior Theater, that we did plays for children, and I was playing Shakespeare. Now, I wasn't good then, and I wouldn't be good today in Shakespeare. Now, I bow to you because you have played and you are good at it. If I tried to change my Middle Western accent, it felt phony to me, and I felt if it felt phony to me, it had to be phony to the audience, so I was never happy playing classics or any of the things in which I had to assume anything but.
Except what about Pierre in War and Peace? I don't remember that.
I don't either.
Seemed
I don't
at all
either. I didn't
Midwestern.
think about it then, and I didn't try to talk differently, and people accepted it, and I was amazed.
Yeah, it was I thought and you went to some lengths sort of to change the way you look.
I tried to, and I had to fight the producer all the way because he didn't want me to
Because I remember
change.
there were curly sideburns.
I had my clothes made to make me look a lot heavier, and I wore glasses and tried to walk with 2 left feet. And Dino De Laurentiis had an idea to have 2 romantic leading men with Audrey Hepburn, and this was not his idea of a romantic leading man. And he'd come on the set and see me with the glasses and say to King Vito, take those off. So I'd have to sneak them on when he wasn't on the set.
What did King think about it?
He never really seemed to. He would just do what Dino said, and he would agree with me if I was talking to him. So, but it did turn out. I was very grateful.
Oh yeah, that's. How did you feel about going into movies before you went into them? Did you have a prejudice against it? I remember, I think, certainly even when I came to New York, why sort of acting was something you did on the stage and
Sure.
movies were...
I don't know that I had a prejudice against it. I just didn't have any ambition to be in the movies. I'm sure I, as you, had many opportunities in those days to casting men from any of the big studios who were based in New York, who were looking for new faces all the time. And I was given an opportunity, but I wasn't curious about it, and never accepted the $75 a week stock jobs. I didn't. And after I got Farmer Takes a Wife, which was my first big break on Broadway, Fox, and it was before 20th Century.
That was your first hit on Broadway in a major role.
That's right, in a major role, you know. I'd done New Faces the year before, but Farmer Takes a Wife was the first. And Fox bought it for Janet Gaynor and offered me all this money to come out to play my part. And I thought, well, I'm not going to tell them they're crazy. I'll come out and take the money and come back.
That would be an ideal way to you just agreed to do the one film at that point.
Yeah. And of course, I had a lot of fun and wound up, I fell in love with Victor Fleming, who directed it. And the studio, as you can still believe, if one thing is good, they got to repeat it.
Yeah.
And I wasn't smart enough to realize that's what they were doing. And they asked me if I would, and I said yes, because I've been having fun, in Way Down East, a remake immediately after Farmer Takes a Wife, which was so close to Farmer Takes a Wife that it was the same thing. And I stayed and did that, and then I did one totally different for RKO.
But you were still doing them on a one-at-a-time basis.
Yeah.
Did you find the transition, people ask you that, they say, how is it different? How do you feel acting in films as opposed to acting in stage? Is it different? How do you do it different?
Quite different, and not quite. It's different for me, and I would use an example or story to explain it. Having played the part of the farmer in New York for 4, 5, 6 months, within a month I'm out here on a outdoor set at Fox doing the part before a camera. And I remember the first day I was rehearsing a scene, I think it was with Slim Somerville and Andy Devine. And by this time I'd become very friendly with Victor Fleming. We're rehearsing, and just before he's ready to take, he sort of took me aside with his arm around me and he said, "Hank, you're mugging." Well, that's a dirty word to me.
Oh boy.
And
one of the last actors I would think that say that of, though.
It didn't take me long to realize that what was happening. I was playing the performance as I had for months before, and those recently in the theater, where you project to reach the balcony and the back row. And that ain't necessary. When the lens is right there and the microphone is right there, you don't project any more than you have to talk to that person.
Sure.
He may have said it that way to me, I don't know, but I got the message right away, and I just pulled back.
Sure.
So actually, the difference is really that kind of difference, is projecting, and then it's more difficult going the other direction. Having been here for a long time, to go back to the theater, and being so easy to play a scene naturally this way. To play that same scene and seem to be as easy and relaxed and natural as you can be, and yet to reach that
two
back
balconies
row.
back,
And I would sort of baby up on it during rehearsals. I learned that 50 years ago. To begin to project a little bit, and so that I didn't do it between the last rehearsal and the first performance, then it would have been phony. You know, if you'd been playing like this in a rehearsal for 4 weeks, and then suddenly you got the audience, and so then you start having to play it like this, trying to be relaxed and natural. Then it feels wrong. So I would do it very gradually until by the time we opened, it didn't seem wrong to be projecting.
Do you find when you go back to the stage after having been in films for a year or two, that you have to kind of get your voice back in training?
Always, yeah. But I'm always a little nervous about it at the beginning. But it's a muscle, as you can well know.
You just
and after you've used it, there it comes. And most recently, I did First Monday for 30 or 40 weeks. And by the time we opened in Washington, that was a strong muscle, and people commented about, wow, what a voice, you know, what resonance.
The one-man thing you did of Clarence Darrow, where you're nonstop speaking and some.
But I don't have that resonance when I'm not in the theater. I don't have it right now. I don't hear it the way I do in the theater. Anyway, it is a muscle that
you've got to get back in training.
Just needs use.
Which do you like better, acting on the stage or acting for film, and why?
Yeah. You really ready?
I'm ready.
You could be ready, depending upon the difficulty of the scene for the cameraman, by 10 or 10:30, and do it. If it's John Ford, the chances are you only do it once. If it's William Wyler, you might do it 30 times. But certainly before lunch, you have played that scene, the film has gone to the laboratory, that's your performance.
That's over.
You never get to do it again. And that was a little scene this big. The next day you do page scene 98, 99, and it's the same story. And after anything from 5 weeks to 15 weeks, you're finished. Somebody else for the next several months puts it together in the proper sequence, puts the sound and whatever music there is in the back of it. And if the audience likes it, you're happy, but you never played the part from beginning to end and felt that you created anything.
Yeah, it's not really your...
No way.
You can make a contribution, a very creative contribution.
I suppose.
Something that nobody else can do even.
And if you hadn't had the other experience, which is theater, you wouldn't know the difference between, or what you'd missed. Now, so we don't. We do it in the theater. And Leland calls me, and you fall in love with the project, and Josh Logan has written this beautiful play. And eventually you come to the Empire Theater, let's say, and rehearse. You rehearse for 4 weeks. Maybe, as in case of Mr. Roberts, about the 10th or 12th day, because he was fast with it, we were not only on our feet, but we were having run-throughs.
Off the books and everything.
Where the director doesn't stop and start.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
Tomorrow we're going to have a run-through. That means you're going to begin at the beginning and go through the play. No wardrobe, no props, you know, kitchen chairs and tables and a bench or something. I'll never forget the first run-through of Mr. Roberts. It's the first time any of us had done Mr. Roberts from beginning to end without starting and stopping. It's the first time, although we knew it was a great play, we loved our parts and so on, it's the first time we experienced the emotion that can happen when you build an emotion on an emotion, go to the end. I mean, that's just the 10th or 12th day. Eventually you open in Boston and New Haven and Philadelphia and try out rehearsing all day still, and you come to New York, which is where it really begins to count. Yeah. But opening night in New York, you rehearsed it for 4 weeks and tried it out with audiences for maybe another 4, 5, or 6 weeks, and you come to New York, you are not only ready, you can hardly wait. I mean, you're like, they're holding you back, I want to go. And that curtain goes up and you begin at the beginning and you go to the end, and not the fact that the audience is there responding, it's that you're doing it at night. And when you finished, you feel that you created something, and you can get to do it again tomorrow and twice on Wednesdays and Saturdays.
Change it, make it better.
Of course. And Roberts is the example we're working on. I did it for like 1,700 odd performances over a period of 4 years in New York and on tour. And Josh, who wrote it and directed it, is the first one to say that the last performance in Los Angeles right here,
is this where you closed?
Was better than the opening night in New York. And opening night in New York was so exciting that, you know, people were standing in their seats wanting you to begin at the beginning and go all over again. Yeah. It was better because you did find little subtleties and areas to make it better. And of course, that's part of the reason that I enjoy long runs. Mm-hmm. Because, as I said, you get to do it again tomorrow and twice on Wednesday. And you get to do it for 1,700 times if it's Mr. Roberts. Mm-hmm. During that time, you're playing to audiences who are coming to see it for the first time. And one of the challenges for me in the theater, and for anybody, is to make it the first time for every one of the audiences. And that added challenge is what keeps it, to me, fresh. Mm-hmm. If you begin to let it down and let it become mechanical and you stop listening to the other actor, you ought to get out of the business. Right. And I go want to spank actors that I watch on the stage that are doing that. Mm-hmm. Anyway, that's in essence the reason that I love theater. I get my jollies in the theater.
Yeah.
That's not to put down the
No,
other
I think
mediums.
film can be
They're just
very
different.
exciting,
Of
but
course
it's
it
different.
can.
I think maybe the creative kick in film mostly belongs to the director.
Oh,
because
of
he
course.
gets to carry it along.
He's the one
he gets
that knows
to play with it in the cutting
from
room.
the beginning. He's the one that knows what's to be on that screen and in what sequence and so on. And he's pointing everything toward that. It's his mind and his imagination. And
oh, yes. Gosh.
I've done 90-odd films. 3 with Sidney Lumet, 1 with Frank Schaffner, and 1 with Paul Newman are the only ones. That's 5.
Yeah. 12 Angry Men, Best Man, and Sometimes a Great Notion.
Sometimes a Great Notion. Were the only films out of 90-odd that we ever rehearsed. 12 Angry Men is an example.
See, they all come from the theater.
Yeah.
12 Angry Men, of course, began as a television piece,
That's right,
didn't it?
yeah. But we rehearsed that with Sidney.
Now, did Sidney do that on television, too?
No. It was his first film, and it was his idea. I didn't know about rehearsing in films, and I never had before. I was grateful that he wanted to, and of course the other 11 actors, it became a love affair for all of us. To be able to play that play as it was theater, and for the last certainly 10 days of the rehearsals, we were doing run-through performances around that table.
That's great. With
Sidney and a cameraman and a script girl in back of us going like this, picking his shots, and we're not paying any attention. But we were playing the play, and for all of us, and they're all New York actors, of course, there were. That was a joy that we had never had before in films.
But let's go back, though, to Mr. Roberts, because it surely has to be one of the best parts of your career. And also, you did it both on film and on the stage. I heard, because I was in New York then, just had come to New York, and of course I saw the play, and you must have known the first time you finished reading it what a piece it was.
We did.
Is it true? I've heard that they had a terrible time cutting it down to a playable length. That the opening night in Philadelphia ran something like 3.5 hours.
It was New Haven. It was after 12 o'clock.
Yeah.
It's true. It was all good. Josh knew that it had to be cut. And Leland, they just didn't know where to cut. Yeah. It finally happened in Baltimore. Emlyn Williams, a close friend of Josh's and a playwright and actor, as you know, came to see it in Philadelphia. And from there, we went to Baltimore. And during the week we were in Baltimore, Emlyn and Josh just sat in a hotel room and went through it line and word by word. And Emlyn would say, "You don't need that. You said that," so on. And that's how the play was cut. And they took 45 minutes out of the play. Unbelievable, 45 minutes.
And mostly interlinear cuts, not whole scenes came out.
The only whole cut was made before we really went into rehearsal. It was a scene in the play that I first heard, and I didn't read it. Josh read it. He wouldn't let anybody read the play. He read it out loud. Anyway, there was a scene. I can't remember their characters' names. Two characters who weren't Roberts or Pulver. I'm almost ready to say their names, but anyway, it was in the book. And Tom and Josh had dramatized the scene. It was very funny. But it wasn't necessary, and they just eliminated the whole scene, which might have been a 20-minute scene in itself.
Now, I know that you'd worked with Logan in Falmouth, but had you worked with him on Broadway at that point?
No. We saw each other all the time. We'd done a film together.
Oh, which film?
I met my love again, I think.
And he was directing it.
He was a co-director with another man whose name I don't remember, for Walter Wanger. He wrote the script with the other man. And by this time, he'd become a pretty well-known New York director and play doctor. He very often was called to Boston plays and tryout to help out a play that was in trouble. He had that reputation. Anyway, he came out under contract to Wanger and co-directed this play with Joan Bennett and me. I don't remember the date, but it was before Roberts.
Another thing I seem to remember was true about Roberts was, it may not have been the first, but was one of the first plays where the actors didn't wear makeup, wasn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
I don't know that it was the first, but we didn't.
And you had
I think it was
sun
the
lamps
first time I had,
backstage so the
yes.
actors could keep
Very
a
expensive
South Pacific
sun lamps that they
tan.
kept in the chorus room down below, and everybody had to lie under that for 15 or 20 minutes every day.
Yeah. There was also, I've heard, a plan to film that with the New York cast during the New York run. Was that ever?
Originally, during the run, Josh and Leland and I talked about going to the Caribbean and taking 6
Renting
weeks
a
off
tramp
during the
steamer or
summer, let's say,
something.
and doing the picture. Partly because Josh became involved in everything else, South Pacific, and from then on, we never got to it. And eventually, I'm on to
other things,
2 other plays before we finally did the movie.
The film wasn't actually made to when? Several years,
well,
3 or 4 years at least after.
1954, and I think we closed it was 4 or 5 years after.
Yeah. And
Josh didn't direct it.
No, John Ford.
John Ford,
became ill.
This was Leland's choice, and I didn't. I said it was the best choice. I mean, he called me, and I said, he's the man if Josh isn't going to do it. But Josh didn't mind. He didn't feel that he was being set aside. He just had so many other commitments. He said to Leland, go ahead and shoot it. I haven't got the time.
And you did work on a tramp steamer, a merchant vessel, a lot.
We did,
for the
yes.
film.
They borrowed it from the Navy, had it brought to Midway. We all flew out to Midway, lived on the island for 4 weeks, and worked on the ship, which was just in the lagoon out there every day for 4 weeks. Then we came back and worked for 4 weeks at Kaneohe in Honolulu.
Yeah. And then Ford became ill and Mervyn LeRoy.
When we came back to the studio within a week, Ford had a kidney attack and had to have a major operation. And Leland just didn't felt he couldn't afford to shut down and wait for maybe 8 or 10 weeks. So without skipping a beat almost, Mervyn LeRoy took over.
Now, a thing I've noticed in other things where you see a great comic moment on the stage and then it's filmed, even if it's well filmed, the audience won't laugh as long. And I remember Jack Lemmon, whose performance as Pulver nobody was ever better. And his entrance and of course he was swimming through a sea, if they could do it, even much bigger. And yet it wasn't quite the laugh that it invariably was on the stage.
I think that's possibly because in the theater, the first time you see it is the entrance into Robert's cabin. In the film, you saw him fighting his way through companionways and passageways and up ladders all through.
And you're beginning to get the comic effect.
Yeah, you've already got the laugh. It's just the difference between, because after all, as you suggested, film, it's not mechanical, but it's not real. It's not blood.
Yeah, it's just pictures. It's light,
moving
light.
Pictures.
Yeah,
and as against the blood and breath of human beings that are alive up on the stage,
50 feet away from you, and it's let's talk some more about some of. We just began to get on to Ford as a director.
Oh yeah,
and John Ford is one of the great directors, one of the no question. Yeah. And you worked in what, 5 or 6, 8 pictures with him. Talk about him a little bit.
Well, I could talk the rest of the day. I'll try hard.
Well, we
not
could do
to.
that, except this is about Hank Fonda.
But I had never met him. I was a fan of his work. I remember working at the Golden Studios for Wanger at the time that Ford was shooting a Stagecoach. And I used to sneak over on the stage and sort of stand in the background and watch. I'd never met Duke. And I remember the first time I realized this tall, huge giant of a man, what a character, how beautiful he was. And I'd watch Ford work. It was within a year, I think, that Fox, was now 20th Century, wanted to do Young Mr. Lincoln. And I was not excited about the idea in the sense that I didn't think I could play Lincoln. They'd come to me and I said, no way, I can't play Lincoln.
And why did you think that, Hank? Because
Lincoln to me is God. I mean,
well,
it's, you know,
but I mean,
like
certainly.
I didn't. I still today feel that I'm not equipped to do some things, and I didn't think I was good enough to play Abraham Lincoln. And as good as I thought the script was, and I won't go into detail, but they persuaded me to do a test, and I did. I let a man take 3 hours to put the nose and the wart and fix my hair to look like a young Mr. Lincoln. And I did a scene with an actress on the set. And the next day, went to see the rushes of the test with...
Did Ford direct the test?
No, he wasn't even assigned to the film. And I remember sitting in the projection room with the... I can't remember the producer and the writer. Anyway, I sat there, and on the screen suddenly comes this man that looked like Lincoln. And I remember thinking, wow, it does look like Lincoln, you know? And then he started to talk, and my voice came out and shattered me. And I said, no way. I've never liked my own voice. I go to few of my films. I never go to the rushes. It's a story I can go back to if you want.
I want to get back to that.
Anyway, I was shattered. I couldn't see myself as Lincoln. My voice coming out of this character that looked like Lincoln. So I just said no. Months later, they assigned Ford to the film, and I get a call to come in to see Mr. Ford at the studios. Now,
you turned it down, you said no, not
totally.
for me.
I said I'm not going to be in your picture, boys. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I'm going to meet this man that's already a legend as far as I'm concerned. As far as the industry is concerned, He was. And I remember coming into his office, and he's sitting at his desk with a slouch hat and the handkerchief in his mouth, you know, and sort of scowling up at me. And I'm standing there like a gob in his white hat before the Admiral almost, you know. And I can't say it before your cameras because Ford talked in profanity mostly. And he was using the words that I can't use. What the expletive is all this about you not playing. He's not the great emancipator. He's a young jack-leg lawyer from Springfield, you know. What he did was he shamed me into it. And it was absolutely true. I was thinking about the great emancipator. And he was right that it wasn't the great emancipator.
A young prairie lawyer.
He was putting out his shingle for the first time. It was one of his first cases. Anyway, he did shame me into it, and I did the film. That was my first with Ford. Within weeks, we were on location in Utah doing the picture with Claudette Colbert and the Indian Wars and
Drums Along the Mohawk.
Drums Along the Mohawk.
That was one of the first films I saw you do.
And within weeks after that, we were doing Grapes of Wrath. I did 3 in a row with Ford. Within between March and the following November, I did 3 films, one right after the other.
You did all 3 of those films in that time?
In that short time. In spring and summer and fall, we did Young Lincoln, Drums Along the Mohawk, and Grapes of Wrath. It's the first time Ford had ever done that many films in a year, I think. It's the first time he'd ever used the same actor consecutively. Anyway, there were a lot of firsts involved, and by the time we'd finished, we were in love with each other, and we almost left the set of Grapes of Wrath and went off to Mexico on his boat, the Mariner, for a 3 or 4 week drinking span, really, and fishing. It was great sword fishing. But that was the beginning of my relationship with Ford.
You know, that's worth underlining, though, that I'm staggered, that business about those 3 films of such quality.
Yeah.
I mean, 2 of them are great, great films, and Drums Along the Mohawk is a very, very good one.
Yes, it is, yeah.
And directors who spend a year and a half on a film nowadays could look to that example. Ford always shot pretty, as you said a minute ago, he sometimes would just do 1 take.
He was unhappy if he had to do more than 1 take.
No kidding. I mean, really, more often than not, it would be 1 take.
More often, yes.
Yeah.
Most of the time. I think if he had to do more than 1 take, it would have been because of something technical that...
or an actor forgetting a line or missing a mark or something.
And if it was technical, if the cameraman said, I didn't quite get that, he would be furious. He might have to do it again, but he was upset. He didn't like it if he had to do more than one take. He had a theory that the first time was the best. From then on, every time you did it was trying to do it again, and it became automatic, repetitive.
Now, of course, that's just the reverse of what you were talking about, and I believe I agree. The part of acting on the stage, that you change and make it better, learn things about it.
Yeah.
How did you feel as an actor having to accept his...
By this time, I think I'm beginning to understand film acting, and Ford, of course. Ford was Pappy. He was.
Yeah. Oh yes,
he was
you had to do it his way.
And if that was the way he wanted to do it, you accepted it. There were times over the 8 films that I did that I would even implore him to do it again because I didn't feel that I was as good as I wanted to be. And he wasn't as bad with me as he was with other actors. In the sense that.
If you really ask him,
I'm hesitating now to talk about it because it sounds like I'm blowing myself up. But he did somehow have a respect for me that that meant that he didn't do the thing that I've heard him do with other actors who say, "Please let me do it again." You want to direct us, and he'd throw the script at him, and insult him.
He could be very rough.
There were many actors who would have an experience with Ford, never work with him again.
He would sometimes sort of pick a goat in a company, I've heard.
Always, yeah. And if Duke or Ward Bond was in the film, they were automatically.
They were the ones.
There was always somebody, yeah.
Now, what about, for example, that incredible last speech you have in Grapes of Wrath? Do you remember?
Remember it very well.
But I mean, do you remember how many takes or how that was to shoot?
I sure do. That's typical of Ford. He didn't rehearse at all, ever. If he rehearsed, it was a technical thing
just
for
to say,
camera.
walk here, walk there.
And actually, that scene was a continuous scene that started in the tent.
I remember.
When I woke up Ma, and we walked out of the tent, and Greg Tolan, the cameraman, had to have the camera follow us from the tent and then dolly down a track maybe 20 or 30 feet to a bench that was beside the dance hall where there'd been the dance the night before. And we sit down on the bench, and that's where the scene started, the dialogue.
I'm not even certain there was coverage on the scene, was there? Is it just in the one shot? I'm not sure of that.
There was eventually.
Yeah.
But the point was that in the rehearsal for Greg, because it was dim lighting, it was starting with a match in the tent and coming out. And so it took him a couple of hours at least to prepare that set technically, that setup. Each time we rehearsed for Greg, we would get to the position on the bench. Ford would cut the rehearsal. He never let Jane Darwell and me read or play our scene during the rehearsals. Now, we both know we've got a scene here to play, and we both knew the lines, and we were both, without even talking to each other, were aware that it was a very special scene, and we wanted to do it. It was like saying,
sure.
Hey, let us. Hey. He never let us read that scene in a rehearsal. He knew that we both knew it. We both knew the values in the scene. That's the way he cast his actors, knowing what he could expect from them. Anyway, eventually Greg is ready, Toland, and we do the scene in a take. And we got to the bench. Now, by this time, Ma Jode, Jane Darwell, and I, we were both so ready, like racehorses chomping at the bit, that the emotion started to almost overwhelm us. And I never talked to Jane, and nor she to me, but I know that she felt as I did at the moment that we were playing the scene, that this was not right, this wasn't good. Don't let it all come spilling out, because that embarrasses all.
Sure, it's too much.
So both of us, I know I did, and I'm sure she did too, was trying to hold back that emotion, keeping the scene going, but don't let it spill out into tears or whatever, dripping or anything. But what it did was to color the scene, color the looks on our faces, color the tones of our voices, I'm sure.
And what the characters would really have been feeling,
Of
trying
course.
not to reveal how upset they were.
And of course, this is what Ford is looking for. Yeah. This is the reason. He didn't want us to dissipate any of this emotion in a rehearsal. And he got it in that take. Now, he did go back after that. I remember he got up after that first take and just walked away. Now, he was probably emotional himself and didn't want us to see it. He didn't say anything. He just got up and walked away and left Ma and me sitting there on the bench, and finally we got up too. Eventually he lined up with Tolan and he shot it in close
single heads. Yeah.
And without talking about it, and just sort of did it and walked away again. So he did cover it. But principally it was that first take. And the reason that he didn't want to ever rehearse it, and that's typical of Ford.
You spoke of Duke Wayne and watching him in a Stagecoach.
Yeah.
And there was a writer in the Times, the London Times, writing about you, said in a succession of Ford Westerns, he embodied the opposite ideal to John Wayne's expansive man-of-action hero. Fonda was the quiet, calculating man, slow to anger, preferring whenever possible to work things out without bloodshed. Do you feel this is reasonable? And that
I think so. That has nothing to do with anything except Duke is Duke.
Yeah. And with the chemistry of a different actor.
I mean, that's the kind of a man he was. You would
taking,
expect it from him. You don't expect it from me. I wasn't 8 feet tall and 3 feet wide, as Duke made you feel he was. Bigger than life. And I didn't play the kind of parts that Duke played.
Mm-hmm. And yet you were as effectively a real Western figure.
Well, I guess so. Yeah. But I don't particularly take any, those are his words, not mine. And I like to hear them, but, and I recognize them, that it's true. But it's the kind of parts that I played is against the kind of parts that Duke played.
And yet Ford recognized that the two would work together very well. Quite often actors would play the same part over and over again. Yeah. As you said, Farmers Takes a Wife, then immediately they wanted you to do the same thing. Were you aware of trying to break this routine?
Yes. I think I might have realized it when I found myself way down east. Mm-hmm. This was a thing that could happen, and I didn't want it to happen anymore.
You'd be playing Farmers for the rest of your career.
Yeah, I could have easily, and lasted about a year and a half, I would have been back to the retail.
All the Farmer parts would be used up.
But I was lucky that I was not, in those early days, contracted to a Darryl Zanuck or anybody who was going to lead my career, and I was able to pick and choose, and I was lucky to have been offered diverse parts to go from way down east to the composer with Lily Pons and I Dream Too Much.
And comedies too.
And then, which was a comedy itself then. Trail of Lonesome Pine, and I'm not going to try to name all of them, but You Only Live Once. And
now, I've heard you say a couple of times, and read you quoted as saying that you felt you got many of your best film parts in loan-outs and
once, of course, I could pick and choose up to Grapes of Wrath, and Zanuck held that out as bait. I mean, everybody wanted to play Tom
You were
Joad.
completely independent till then. That was very rare then. Everybody was under contract.
And I had just resisted taking long-term contracts. Mm-hmm. And I had done 3 or 4 at the studio. Jesse James, which was a good film for me.
Oh, yes. And, forgive me, Ford didn't direct that.
No, that was Henry King.
Henry King, yeah.
And Young Lincoln and drums. And then with Grapes, he had been after the contract before that, but this was bait. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to give you this plum part and then let you go over to MGM and play with Joan Crawford. Now, I'm saying that's what Darryl Zanuck said, and I'll come to that later. And
you did Young Mr. Lincoln and Drums Along the Mohawk, still independent, still your own man.
And then he wants me on the contract, and I thought, well, this man really wants to guide my career in life in the right way. He made sense to me.
Well,
So
after three parts like that,
I signed the contract. So now I'm exclusively contracted to Zanuck and 20th Century Fox, and I did Grapes of Wrath. You wouldn't be expected to remember, nor anybody else, what my next film was for Darrell Francis Zanuck at 20th Century Fox. It was Lillian Russell. Fay Ray was Lillian Russell. Don Amici was the other leading man, and I played not even a third part. It was a very minor part. I played Lillian Russell's husband. It was a nothing part. This was protecting me. Anyway. I could go on and on and on about the rest of my life at 20th Century Fox, which was a succession of that kind of parts.
What would have been the reason for him to do that? I mean, it seems so obviously stupid.
I thought so, but he...
Well, it clearly is. I mean...
anyway, I won't go on. The poor man is not...
No. Well, anyway. I don't mean to indict him personally. It was a system.
I do indict him personally. I blame him, and I have for years. But when you said, you quoted as saying you got the best parts on loan on, it was after Grapes of Wrath that I would fight him on these parts. Maybe 3/4 of the time I'd lose and wind up playing the husband of Lillian Russell. But every now and then I would win, and I would be loaned over to Paramount to do Lady Eve with Barbara Stanwyck, or Male Animal with Elliot Nugent at Warner Brothers, or another one with Barbara at Columbia called You Belong to Me, I think it was. Anyway, and the one with Lucille Ball at RKO Big Street. Those were the good films that kept me going through those years, rather than anything I did at 20th Century, except almost the last film I did there, which was Oxbow Incident, and that was a fluke. We did it in like 30 days, a very short schedule. And then I joined the Navy the day after we finished, and I was gone, but Bill told me the rest of the story afterwards. He finished the film, and they sneaked it in Long Beach, I think, and Zanuck and Virginia went down with Bill to see it. They hated it, and said so in so many words. By the time I'm back after the war, the picture had been released and not done business particularly, but it had become a prestige picture. It got beautiful
Great
reviews.
notices, yeah.
But by the time I got back, Darrell was taking bows for Oxbow Incident because it was a prestige picture. It didn't ever lose money because it didn't cost anything. So,
and besides, it plays all the time still.
Of course.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my sort of encapsulated history of my career with Darrell Francis Zanuck. I eventually got out of the contract partly the war, because the war took me 3.5 years, and there were precedents made by the time I got back. Olivia de Havilland made it, I think you remember.
Yes.
And
she sued Jack Warner.
They couldn't tack on the years that you were away under the end of your 7-year contract, I think mine was.
So your contract was over.
I only had a year to go when I came back, which meant 3 films. He wanted to renew the contract, and I didn't want to. We finally made a deal in which I would give him 3 films, not necessarily all in 1 year. And so I did one, which was with Joan Crawford. That's what I was going to segue to. I'm not going to let you go to MGM and do a picture with Joan Crawford if we give you this Grapes of Wrath. I did a film, Outer Preminger, directed with Dana Andrews and Joan Crawford. Now, this is not to put down Joan Crawford, because I liked her as an actress and as a person, and it was not a bad movie. But it was Darrell Zanuck putting me in a picture with
Just
Joan.
what he said
Anyway,
he wouldn't do. Yeah.
I did that one, and before I could do another one for Zanuck, Mr. Roberts, the play, came along, and I was in that for 4 years, so my contract had expired by the time, and I didn't owe him anything more.
Yes. And then the one with Ford,
Darling Clementine?
No, I know that was later, about the priest.
The Fugitive.
The Fugitive,
Yeah.
yes.
That was
that was after.
Well, it was just one of the pictures that I could do, because I only owed Fox one a year.
Nice.
And I did do, I'm forgetting that I did do Darling Clementine with Ford. That's the first picture that either of us did when we came back from the Navy. And then the Joan Crawford
Again,
picture.
kind of a landmark picture for both of you. Yeah.
And this is all Ford, who, incidentally enough, or interestingly enough, the studio, Fox, had made a picture of Wyatt Earp during the war, and Ford came back and saw it somehow and said, I can do better than that, and they let him, and he did Darling Clementine.
You know, there's that. Let's talk about that a minute. At least one scene. The picture of you that hangs in the hall here at the AFI from when you won the Life Achievement Award is, of course, that still from My Darling Clementine, of you leaning back in the chair.
Oh, in the chair? Yeah.
That scene is a marvelous actor's idea.
It
The
wasn't
thing of the
an
guy.
actor's idea.
Well, it's the kind of idea that an actor sees it, and you say, "Yeah, that's a great."
I liked it, but it
thing
was
to hang
Ford's
that on.
idea.
Was it his idea?
Oh yeah, and
Tell him about it, 'cause
As you
it's,
suggest, it's a moment that everybody. I went to a film festival in Karlovy Vary, Czechoslovakia, for the Best Man.
Mm-hmm.
I was meeting these producers and directors, particularly Czechoslovakians, who would, through an interpreter, say, I saw Darling Clementine, and they would say, this, that's the scene they would remember.
Yeah.
Anyway, it happened because I'm on the set, in the chair, to be photographed. I'm not sure that Kathy didn't have an entrance from the hotel during the scene. In any case, I'm sitting there alone, not with anybody else, no dialogue. And I think I had pushed myself back, and I put my feet up there, just waiting.
On the railing, yeah.
Just waiting. It was the post.
The post, yeah.
And my feet were like this on the post, just in one position. And when they were ready to shoot, I got down from it. He said, no, we'll put them back up, Ford. So I did, and before we started to shoot, he said, change position. In other words, do this. And he made a sort of a ballet out of it. It was Wyatt sitting back there playing, balancing himself and doing this. And so it was really his idea.
I'm sure there are people that can't remember the name of My Darling Clementine or who you played in it, but they remember, they say, what was that Western where you lean back and put your boots up in the post?
All the time,
I've thought myself, and I'd be interested in your opinion on this, it's certainly better for the group of actors and directors and actresses and a few writers that get to have some control and ability to guide their own careers. But I've often thought that there was this advantage to the studio period. They did make a lot of movies, and they had the B programs. Now, you never went through that because you began doing parts you wanted to do, and finally you signed the contract as a kind of to get the one role. But it seemed to me that maybe there was that to be said, that young directors and actors and writers, you got a lot of turns at bat.
You bet. Jim Stewart would be the first one to vote for the old studio system of a stable of actors. He was under contract. He didn't come out quite the way I did. He came out about 3 or 4 months after I did, under stock contract to MGM. And when he went into the war and came back, as I did 3.5 or 4 years later, and L.B. Mayer wanted him to re-sign, he was ready to. He felt grateful to Mayer and to MGM for his career in the films.
You said you were talking about your good parts being away from the studio, that maybe they would borrow people for the good parts that they couldn't cast at their own studio.
Yeah. I think Maggie Sullivan was responsible because she
knew him.
Was a close intimate friend of Jim's, as of mine and Swope's, and she knew Jim's work, and she knew Jim could play it, and she was one that asked for Jim, and they got him.
Mm-hmm. Then wasn't he this would be some time after the war, but wasn't he one of the first actors that had the participation deals?
That's
Lou
Wasserman of MGA.
Yes, MCA then.
MCA, yeah. I think Winchester, one of those
Winchester
films,
70s.
was one of the first ones that he became a participating. Yeah.
But there was something to be said for the studio system, in a sense. We've talked in directors mostly about Ford and Josh Logan. What other directors have you worked for that you feel are
I've had so many, and they're all and so many good
Wellman,
ones.
of course, yes.
Oh, yeah. It was a great experience with Bill and Oxbow. But I did one with William Wyler, Jezebel.
Yeah.
I will tell the story, and Willie can listen to this, and it would not make him mad. I was advised by everybody I can think of not to have any part of it because of Wyler. He's a monster.
He can be rough. Oh,
That's
boy.
what they said. Yeah. I mean, I remember Bogart, who had worked with him, said, don't go close to him. He'll wear you out. On the contrary, I loved Wyler. I still do. And I had a marvelous experience with him. And it was a good picture and good for me. Yeah. And he did do it 20 and 30 takes. But unlike some other directors who can remain unnamed, he always had a reason. But as I began to say, I've been so lucky over the years that I've had George Stevens in a short way, in a very funny comedy. John Huston in a short time, and Sidney Lumet eventually.
Frank Schaffner,
yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm probably forgetting some, but Henry Hathaway, I've done 2 or 3 with Hathaway.
Yes, now
and Henry King.
Hathaway had a reputation of being rough.
Yes, he did, and I saw it happen, and often on the set, and it was always a little embarrassing, but I could understand it. Hathaway, for me, incredibly, because his background wasn't certainly Sidney Lumet's or what background. I mean, he'd come up through the ranks and sort of a property boy and assistant directors and so forth, and he becomes a director. Where does he get this sensitivity? And Preminger was like that. I liked Preminger. I did 4 things with Preminger, including a play. But and I was always embarrassed to have him blow up at the electrician or whoever, the extra. But at the same time, I enjoyed him as a director, and I felt that he had great communication with actors.
Since this program is under the auspices of the Screen Actors Guild, I think we should spend some time talking about acting. And since you have, as much as any other actor, divided your career between film and the stage, we did talk a while ago explore which is better and why it's better and which is more satisfying. But could you talk a little about how you go at a part? Let's say take a specific part first on the stage, and then let's take Roberts. You talked about Logan reading it to you, but as an actor preparing the role and rehearsing it, how that or any role?
I don't really, Chuck, feel that I'm preparing it, particularly a play like Mr. Roberts or a character like Mr. Roberts. Not quite the same as for playing young Lincoln or Clarence Darrow, but for Roberts, as I say, Josh read the play. I was an audience. He sat there. David Wayne and I were in the room listening to Josh read Mr. Roberts. I didn't know anything about it. This was December. I think it was the day after Christmas I flew back. And within days, we were in rehearsal.
Now, I had days after that.
Yeah, because it was October, November, I think, that I heard the play read. And within just weeks, they were having auditions and tryouts, and they had cast the play. And I'm back there within just weeks and in rehearsal. So I hadn't done any preparation. I didn't feel I had to. I mean, there it was. I mean, you're an actor, you know that.
The part
if you identify with that character, what is there to research?
To figure out,
In the theater, it's the preparation is in the 4 weeks of rehearsal. In films, let's say the same kind of a part, there's not too much preparation. It's meeting with and talking to the director, let's say. Maybe not too much, maybe a lot. It's different depending on the director. But again, you are called by an assistant director and you learn maybe 3 pages to start the first day's work, and that's all. 5 times in my life have I rehearsed 2 weeks before we started shooting, and there were golden hours for all of us to be able to. But in contrast, if you want to go on with the preparation for the part, preparing for Clarence Darrow, let's
Yes,
say.
that's a good example.
I was sent this script, and it came in the mail out of the blue. I didn't know it was coming. And I remember reading, as I opened the script, Clarence Darrow. Yeah, he was that lawyer when I was in college that defended those two kids in
The Loeb
Chicago.
Leopold,
That's the most I knew about Clarence Darrow, I'm ashamed to have to admit. I read this play, fell in love with the man and the play. I never thought about what kind of a job it would be to do this one-man play. I just was in love with the man and the concept, and agreed to do it. Then, and we had plenty of time, I read Darrow's autobiography. I read a dozen books about him, short essays, short pieces, a lot of things that were written because in his life as a lawyer, he also loved to lecture or debate on Chautauqua Circuit with a priest, a Protestant minister, a rabbi, and he was the agnostic on is there a God or whatever. He loved it, and they used to tour. They became very close, the rabbi and the priest and the minister. And I read some of those debates. I did everything. I read everything I could find about Darrow.
What you're saying, sort of, is that if you're playing a real figure like Darrow,
that somebody would recognize, would know, and
that you have a responsibility to find out what he was like.
Yeah, I had read War and Peace. I didn't read it because I was offered the part. I had happened to have read the book, and I loved the part when the script was given to me. It was about that thick, and Irwin Shaw had written it. And I thought, they're crazy. That's not the way I would cast it, but I didn't tell them, and I just jumped at the chance. And read the book again and began to plot how I wanted to look, and then I've already suggested it. I had to fight the producer to look that way a lot. But I don't know that I have a way to prepare a part. I wouldn't know how to teach a class, how to approach acting, really. Oh, what's the one I did with Andy Bancroft?
It's Two for the Seesaw.
Two for the Seesaw.
I was just going to ask you about that, because that was a very difficult part to find,
very difficult,
wasn't it?
and we were sitting at a table, the two of us, with the director and the author. Bill Gibson was there every moment. And we read that play at a table for 10 days before we got on our feet. There were problems in that play, and I could write a book or talk the rest of the day about Two for the Seesaw, and I don't think it's necessary or relevant to anything. But there were problems in the play that Bill Gibson said he recognized early in my relationship to it, but never resolved. And they were my problems from then on, and it's the reason that I had a problem during the rehearsals and for the year or a little bit more that I played the part in New York. It was never more than a one-dimensional part. And you know what it's like to try to play a character that hasn't been fully drawn by the writer. And that's what I was fighting.
You touched on the business of rewriting and the different rule that prevails in film and the theater, where in the theater you can't change a word that the playwright...
Once you've opened. Oh, you're not allowed to.
Yeah, I mean that the writer has to approve.
Exactly, yeah.
Any change. And in film, often the writer isn't even around when you're shooting.
Not consulted, no.
No, and changes, and writers have asked me this, and how do you feel about that, the difference? And
well, I don't think that's wrong. If you've got a stubborn author, like Bill Gibson was, it's a problem. But I couldn't have solved it.
No.
If he had let me, I couldn't have rewritten that play I kept begging him. I said, try this or that, but I wouldn't have known how, and he didn't know how.
I think in film, there may be a difference. There are things that turn out to be true about a film script that you can't find out till you're out there in the ground.
Right. That's right.
And actors are talking and the horses are going by or whatever it is. And I kind of like changing in a
I don't mind it at all. And I really never found a writer in films that felt he'd been, put down or hurt in any way if the director did or the actors did make small changes.
Well, we were for instance, the thing with the boots on the post. There's no way to write that, and yet it can be as important as any moment.
A lot
of
of things in Ford films, and as I said, I did 8 of them, were not in the script.
And the stage, the play, the words are the thing, and the actor is the medium that conveys them. And they've got to be right, because that's all there is, and the actor's speaking them. But in film, it's pictures. And it may be something very moving in a picture, won't even have an actor in it or a word spoken. Right. It's harder to write those things. It's harder to discover them.
It's the difference in the two mediums, really, Chuck. It's if in films you could go to Philadelphia and Boston and Washington with this cast and the writers, you would be rewriting, as you do every play you do.
Sure. How do you feel, especially an actor in your position of such a towering reputation, when how do you see the authority of the director in terms of supposing you disagree with the director on a scene?
Well, the director is boss.
Yeah.
He's captain of the ship. That's not to say that an actor's instincts may not agree totally with something that the director has in mind. And usually, I'm trying to think, Ford's the only one that would resist an idea from an actor, from most actors, and he would throw the script at him and say, "You want to direct it?"
Yeah.
But I found that most directors, good directors, will listen to an actor if he's got any respect for him at all, and pay attention, either try it the actor's way or agree totally, or persuade the actor that he's wrong.
Yeah,
but I've never found a director generally that minded being commenting or talking about a scene that they don't agree about.
I think that too. I think that's a question that's often presented, and I thought I had to throw it in, but I think people imagine there's a great deal more conflict than there is, both in a play or in a film.
I don't think there's too much conflict.
Even a director like Ford, who had a reputation as something of a martinet, you could get to. What about this? Of course, would only be true. Well, I know something I want to ask you about. I've found the hardest thing about film is you may start with a scene at the end, and then you come to do the scene before it a couple of weeks later, and you say, I wish I'd remembered that. I wish I'd realized this. What you were saying earlier, you don't get the chance to play the whole. Do you have any solution for this?
No, there's no solution.
It's just one of the problems of the medium. Yeah.
You have to count on the director, who's the one who's got the final picture in his mind, and that if he's satisfied, if he's not troubled by whatever's troubling you, you just got to go along with him.
Yeah. What about on the stage? Because this, of course, wouldn't come up in films. As you said, you find it a pleasure and a special satisfaction to play a long run in a play. And yet many actors will say after 5 or 6 months, it's becomes harder to keep it fresh, and you feel you've found all the good stuff you can find. Obviously, that's been a different experience for you. Could you talk about that a little?
Well, I can only say that that's the way I feel. Mm-hmm. I enjoy, assuming that I like the part and like the company and the play, I enjoy playing it long, long runs. That's not to say that I've also been in plays that didn't work out as well as I had dreamed of, and I still had to play it for 2 years because I was contracted to. Mm-hmm. And Seesaw, maybe not the best example of what I'm talking about. I had done, I won't name them, but a couple of other plays that did not turn out the way I thought they should, and yet were successful. Mm-hmm. And one of them I played 2 years, and it wasn't that much fun.
Was that?
I mean, I still tried to keep it fresh and first time for an audience, but it wasn't the joy that I normally look for in the theater.
In that case, in a case like that, it becomes a matter of discipline, doesn't it? You impose,
Has to be.
make it work for yourself, make it fresh.
No.
But a part like, say, Roberts, throughout the run, you are actually finding new things in it.
When I say finding new things, they were this big.
Sure. Oh, I don't mean big.
Because I like a story that's apocryphal. I'd heard it about George M. Cohan, and I read a book, biography of George Kaufman the other day that used the same story about somebody else. I don't remember. But the story is that a play opened, let's say let's say it's George M. Cohan, who wrote, produced, directed, and starred in everything that he did. And he opens the play, and it's a big hit, and gets great reviews. And about the second or third month, as the actors come to half hour to the backstage, there's a notice on the bulletin board, there will be a rehearsal tomorrow morning at 1:30 to take out the improvements.
Yeah.
Now that kind of improvement is the kind that you don't.
You got to watch those.
That's right, because actors are apt to hear the beginnings of a laugh maybe and say, oh, I want to get that, and start to try to get that laugh so hard that they lose another one. Or start to mug because they've been told it's funny and they get overboard, they go overboard. That kind of improvement has got to be cut out, and it takes the director to do it. Or a strong stage manager who's got the authority to go to a star and say, I'm sorry, but you so-and-so.
Or often young players, like I imagine some of the sailors and Mr. Roberts would put in all kinds.
But now, what did this start out to be? A question.
How you keep it fresh and keep it, and discovering things through a play.
I remember Bob Keith, who played Doc in Roberts, and was a joy to work with as an actor. And we used to enjoy, having played the scenes on stage, getting together in the dressing room and talking about the scene. Did you notice there was that, and they're this big. They're so subtle that the average person doesn't know the difference. And it's not the kind of improvement that you want to rehearse to take out, or the director does, but that on the contrary, that the director, Josh Logan, would come the third month or the third year and say, how do you do it? It just gets better. Now those are the good words that you like to hear.
Well, that's partly discipline.
That's what makes it worthwhile. So it's playing it over and over again, and just slowly recognize little values that you're amazed that hadn't occurred to you 2 months before or 2 years before.
I know. I want to talk about, you've said that you don't like to see your movies and don't like to see daily. Now, is that, because I've felt that you can learn something from daily.
You sure can, if you can be objective, which I never was able to do. It probably happened to me because I didn't know what dailies were. I'm out here back now to the first picture I did, Farmer Takes a Wife, and crazy about Victor Fleming, and we finished the first day's work, and it was fun. I mean, I'd played it in the theater for how many months on a proscenium stage with cutout trees and a bank of something that went up to what was supposed to be the canal, and a fireplace, the blacksmith's forge that was sort of an exterior set you could see, and the red gelatin on the bulb that went like this to make you think there was a fire in the blacksmith. Well, now I'm out on the back lot of Fox, and it's real sun and real sky and clouds and real water in the canal and a real fire in the blacksmith's forge. This was all exciting. I was having a ball. So we finished the first day, we come back and work the second day, and we break for lunch. The first day we'd broken for lunch, and I went and had lunch with Victor. And the second day we're breaking for lunch, and I go along with Victor as I had the first day, only we don't go to the commissary. We go to a projection room. And I go along because it's Victor. I don't know what's going to happen. And I find myself sitting in this projection room with Victor and the cameraman and some others, and the Rushes, the Dailies, my first experience. Here I come on the screen as Farmer in Farmer Takes a Wife, which I had played in the theater for X months. And that wasn't what I thought I looked like or what I sounded like. And I went into shock. I really did. It was a terrible experience for me. I had never seen myself on a screen. I'd never heard my voice. on a tape.
Mm-hmm.
It had never happened to me.
Yeah.
Now, you know that it's the first time for anybody.
Yeah.
It's always strange.
Yes.
Is that what I sound like? Is that what I look like? It was too much for me, and Victor realized that I was terribly upset, so he just never took me to rushes again. And from that day, except for one special situation when I was doing a picture at Male Animal, actually.
At Warner's, yeah.
At Warner's, that we had to pick up a scene that followed a scene that we had done 4 weeks before, because Olivia de Havilland had been taken away to do something else. Now she was back. And Elliot Nugent wanted us to look at the scene that we had done 4 weeks before, because we were not going to be shooting a scene.
It was really...
And it was a comedy scene. I don't remember what it was, but I remember sitting on a sofa and there was a comedy scene. And I go to see the rushes. And I remember thinking in doing the scene, this is funny. If I wait 3 beats, let's say, before I look or before I say the next word, or whatever it was a tiny, tiny thing. Well, the cutter, in the meantime, had eliminated that, and it wasn't funny to me when I saw it in this
He,
rushes.
meantime, assembled the scene.
Yeah.
Rough cut,
And
yeah.
I thought, I don't have any control. Somebody else is timing this thing. And that upset me. So again, I just stopped going to rushes. Now, for the same reason, with very few exceptions, I don't go to the films when they're finished. Mm-hmm. I did see Grapes of Wrath.
I hope
I
so.
saw Darling Clementine.
You
I
missed
saw
something.
Oxbow. And I suppose I saw a dozen others. But most of them, I wasn't curious enough to go through the agony of watching myself on screen. And it is agony. Now, on the other hand, as you said, you can learn. Jim Stewart does, Cary Grant did, and they could look objectively and say, I will never do that again, or
I think that's what you learn. You learn
I've got
the
to
bad
go back
things.
and do that scene again. That was very bad for these reasons. And they can do it. I can't do it. I just get sort of sick in my stomach.
You were speaking of, and as I said, I'm glad you saw Grapes of Wrath. If you missed some of the others, you missed something special. But still, you must have parts in your mind that you remember, the ones that, Oxbow Incident, 12 Angry Men, Grapes of Wrath, My Darling Clementine, Roberts, are perhaps the films.
Less than the play, yeah. Lady Eve was one that I like to remember.
Lady Eve, yeah. And on the stage, what would be your favorite of?
Well, for different reasons. Roberts, of course, was a landmark for me. I played it, as I've already said, for over 1,700 performances.
During that period when you were, 8 years on the stage?
Yes, because after Roberts, we began by saying what other plays are memorable to you. Roberts, certainly. But right after Roberts, I did Point of No Return for 2 years, which was not that memorable in many ways, but there were many things about it that were rewarding. It was an audience play, really, more than it was for us as actors. There was an identification with audiences that people used to come back to tell me, my ribs are sore, my wife kept poking me. Anyway, following that came Court Martial, which I played for a little over a year, and that, for other reasons, is something that I remember.
Oh, that last speech was.
That's right,
was
and it
special.
became, again, it's memorable to me probably for the actors' problems that I had, and we're here to talk about acting, so I think maybe I should take a little bit more time. We rehearsed here in Los Angeles for 4 weeks, and it was booked on a 13-week tour across country on the way to New York. Unlike rehearsing in New York and playing Boston, But this was the way Paul Gregory was producing, and it was all right with me. Charles Lawton, who was co-producer, took over the direction the last week of the rehearsals for reasons that aren't necessary to go into, and had to cut about 40 minutes out of the length of the play, which nobody had done, and was a big problem. He recast 4 or 5 of the minor characters and got the play, and we were to open in Santa Barbara, got the play on and opened in Santa Barbara, and we were not really that ready. Then he had to leave because he had a one-man tour of his own booked, And he came to me, and from one night stands in Santa Barbara and then Long Beach and then San Diego, he said, I got to go, but he said, I'm going to put you in charge. And we were practically, it was on like a bus tour. Uh-huh. Many times we were between towns on bus.
One night stands.
One night stands.
Oh.
And so it meant that you were spending most of your day on a bus, and you would get to a town, barely time to maybe have a meal at 4:30 or 5 and take a nap and go to the theater. Mm-hmm. So how do you work as an assistant to Charles Laughton, as the director at the time? And it needed direction. There were scenes that we had not really solved because we hadn't had that kind of time in rehearsal. The only chance I had was to sit next to an actor on the bus for 15 or 20 minutes and then change to sit next to this actor on the bus. But anyway, during those 13 weeks, we were practically every time getting reviews that were ecstatic about the play, but without exception were saying, but why are we subjected to this epilogue, this embarrassing, anticlimactic, gratuitous, all sorts of words that critics used. And this upset me, and I thought, and this was the scene you're talking about.
Yes.
They didn't feel that they needed it. They were totally satisfied emotionally when a play...
With bringing down Captain Queeg.
When Queeg was dissolved and destroyed on the set and made his exit. That, for them, was the play. Why are we subject to this? Well, we were in Boston before I finally had Herman Wouk and Charles Laughton with us. And they joined us in Boston, and I had my meeting with them, and I had collected these reviews. And I said, in essence, fellows, we've got a problem. And as I've already outlined to you. And Herman wouldn't listen to dropping this scene. That was his reason. When Laughton persuaded him to write the play, that was his reason for deciding that he would do the play, this little epilogue scene. Laughton, realizing that Herman insisted on the scene, he, as the man, if dramaturgy is the word, if it isn't, I don't know what the word is, who was aware that if you're going to have that scene, you, by God, have to make the audience ready for it. Yeah. They obviously weren't ready for it. They had had enough. Catharsis, whatever it is. So in order to make the audience want more, he had Wouk insert little one-lines, short scenes in the body of the play. In the beginning of the play, maybe before the court comes in session, let's say. During the trial itself, when Merrick, and I'm the defense for Merrick, would lean forward and ask me something, and I would say something to him. And the fact that my character didn't seem to pay too much attention through the first act. What Charles was having Herman do was to insert little things that made the audience not fully resolved, but what's eating Greenwald? There was still a question that they hadn't had answered.
To prepare the epilogue, really.
So they were ready for an epilogue. We put those scenes in between Boston and New York in the next 2 or 3 weeks that we were on tour. We came into New York, and not one, and in those days there were like 12 or 14 papers and critics in New York, not one of them said anticlimactic, gratuitous, unnecessary, not one. In other words, Charles Laughton had got Herman to do this so that the audience wanted to see it. Now, on top of that, there was the other actor's problem for me, and that was, even though they would want to see this, I will use one example. The Navy editor for the New York Sunday magazine section saw the play, and where all the critics the next day or through the next several days were saying, huzzah, huzzah. 3 or 4 weeks later, this Navy editor wrote a piece for the Sunday magazine section in which he took exception to that epilogue. And it's perfectly understandable. And I won't go into the details because it's not necessary now. But I recognize it, and I think Herman did, and maybe, and Laughton did, and maybe Herman. Was it really an excuse, and should there be that point made? I discovered, playing the part, that if I could get the audience so emotionally involved in that scene, they couldn't intellectualize. If I wasn't emotionally involved enough, they could say, I don't know whether I agree with that, philosophy or thinking the way Herman wanted them to. But if they were involved emotionally,
if you carried them along.
And they would come back to the dressing room not able to say, yeah, but that last thing, they couldn't even talk. They would say,
yeah.
Well, how do you, as an actor, get the emotion, the audience that emotionally involved? Now, to go back to the scene that Ma Jode and I put together, you don't let it come pouring out because they just want to look away. But I realized that if I could become somehow to them so emotional myself that they were emotional, they wouldn't intellectualize. And this became a job for me, a problem for me, every performance. And I wasn't able to do it, every performance. And I've used the expression, I remember talking to my daughter Jane when she was just beginning to be an actress, that I found playing that scene, that if I could get into the scene, it's like an amphibious airplane that has to get up in taxiing up onto, there's a word for it, and I'm not sure I can remember. It's a part of
on the step, isn't it?
On the step, exactly. Yeah. It could get up onto the step, and then it wasn't sluggish anymore. It could still be on the water, picking up speed before it took off. If I could get that scene like I was the plane taking off up onto that step, then it was just a question of holding the reins back and not letting it go too far.
That's very good. That's a very good image, Hank. Yeah. It's, of course, so many of the parts you've played. We've been talking about that audiences all over the world remember, and Grapes of Wrath, and that's it. Scenes, moments.
I had
like
a
that.
wonderful experience at the theater with a play called Gift of Time that Garson Kanin wrote and directed. It was a true story. I don't know whether you saw it or know about it.
Yes, I do.
It was a true story about a man who was the foreign editor for Time Life, and lived in the south of France near the Spanish border. And began to have stomach pains, came back to New York and had some examination. They decided he had terminal cancer, and there was nothing to do about it. It was too late for an operation. And he'd elected to go back and live the last weeks or months in his beautiful home in the south of France. He didn't tell his children. His wife knew, of course. So it's a play about a man dying of cancer. It was a beautiful play. It was a mature love story, really. And I remember Hedda Hopper as an example. In writing about it, I hear Hank, Fonda, and Olivia de Havilland do this play about a man dying of cancer. Wow, I mean, she practically made that. And so, we got brilliant, beautiful reviews, but nobody came to see it. Not enough people came to see it. I think it ran maybe 5 months and didn't get its money back. But an experience I'd never had before or since in quite the same way. We played the Ethel Barrymore Theater, I remember, and from the stage door of the Ethel Barrymore Theater to the sidewalk where the car would be was a kind of an alleyway. The audience could exit into that alleyway too, out to the sidewalk. And when I came from the dressing room through the stage door, that alleyway from the stage door, which was maybe 100 feet to the sidewalk, was lined with people, audience. Not one of them said, "May I have your autograph, Mr. Fonda?" They were all saying, Now, that they had an experience that day that was so special to them, they wanted to let you know. I get emotional remembering it.
Sure.
That was so special. So when you say, what plays do you, there's so many of them.
Some of the failures can be the most valuable memories.
Yeah.
Of course, that's the lovely thing about that you've done so many of those things in films, because those we still have.
Yeah.
For the plays, I think I heard a story about the opening night of Mr. Roberts, that they screamed and stood in the seats.
Noel Coward was standing on his seat. It's true, yeah.
Yeah. And is it true, the story that you finally did one?
I did, and I was totally unprepared for this kind of a reaction or ovation, They just wouldn't quit.
Mm-hmm.
And the curtain kept going up and up and down. And finally, I signaled to the stage manager, leave it up, and he did, and I stepped one step forward, and they stopped applauding. And I said, that's all they wrote. We'll start again at the beginning, and they started again.
Yeah. Well, I think, Hank, that's something audiences would love to see for your whole career, to have you start all over again. I must say it's been a marvelous experience for me to sit and talk through the morning about it.
I've enjoyed it.
I thank you for sharing it with everybody.
Thank you.
God bless.